Today is Wednesday, April 17th, 2024. The interviewee is Nathan Lewin. We're conducting the interview in Potomac, Maryland. And my name is Jeannie Glucksman, and the language of the interview is English. Good afternoon, Mr. Lewin. Would you please introduce yourself to us?
My name is Nathan Lewin, L-E-W-I-N. I was born in Lodz, Poland, January 31, 1936. I'm now 88 years old and hope to make a couple of more years.
Can you describe for me your family? Who was part of your family before the war started?
I had a very distinguished ancestry, really. My great-great-grandfather was the chief rabbi of Lvov, of Lemberg, and a leading rabbinic decider who issued 6 volumes of tshuvot, of responsa, that are the basis for substantial Jewish law today. He was Yitzchak Shmelkes. His daughter married Natan Levine, who was my great-grandfather, after whom I'm named. Natan Levine was a great rabbinic scholar, and he became chief rabbi of the town of Rzeszów, Resha in Yiddish. And as chief rabbi of that town, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he was an official rabbinic authority, and almost the only photograph I have of him is when he was inducting Jewish soldiers into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he's in front of them and sort of apparently making a speech to them. His son, Rabbi Aaron Levine, was a brilliant, absolutely brilliant rabbi and scholar who taught himself Polish. Beautiful Polish. I was told when I was young by people who still remembered his speeches in Polish how eloquent they were. As a young rabbi in the town of Sambor in Poland, he was elected to the Polish parliament by the Jewish community of Poland, which at that time was really unified in various ways, and he was a leading rabbinic representative of the Polish Jewish community. He wrote commentaries on Torah. On the train, he said, when he would travel to meetings of the Polish Sejm, of the Polish Congress. And because he was an elected member of the Polish Congress, the government paid for him to travel first class by train. And in his books, he's thankful to the Polish government that they provided this opportunity for him to sit in the train and write these commentaries on weekly portions of the Torah, which he would ultimately published. But as a Jewish representative in the Polish parliament, he represented the Jewish community in battles on their behalf. And he was one of first very few leading Orthodox Jewish representatives in the Polish parliament. Among others who he knew and befriended was the famous rabbi who originated the Daf Yomi, the daily study of Talmud, Rabbi Meir Shapiro, who founded the Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin in Lublin. And he was very close to my grandfather, Rabbi Aaron Lewin. On a trip that Rabbi Shapiro made to other countries in Europe to collect funds for his new yeshiva, which was really quite a revolutionary institution in Poland, because in that section of Poland, in Galicia, as opposed to Lithuania, there were really very few yeshivas. I mean, people would learn with rabbis and they'd be ordained to be rabbis. But Rabbi Meir Shapiro started a yeshiva in Lublin and then went around collecting funds, including trips to the United States, by the way. And when he traveled to Amsterdam, he met a wealthy Jewish businessman in Amsterdam who had been born in Poland, but early on moved to Amsterdam and then to Berlin and then back to Amsterdam. And that was my maternal grandfather, Naftali Sternheim. Naftali Sternheim had two children, a daughter and a son. The daughter, whose name was Pepi or Pesla, was raised as an Orthodox woman in Amsterdam and then studied at the University of Berlin. They moved to Berlin in order to enable her to attend the University of Berlin. She studied there. They moved back to Amsterdam, and Naftali Sternheim met Rabbi Shapiro on one of his fundraising trips and said he had followed the fact, since he originally came from Galicia and from Poland, he was born in Poland, told him that he understood that the chief rabbi of Rzeszów, of Rasha, who was in the Polish parliament, had a son named Isaac who was very modern in terms of his education, had a very solid Torah education, but had also received a doctorate of laws from the University of Lvov. That was my father, Isaac Lewin. And Naftali Sternheim asked Rabbi Shapiro whether he could talk to his friend, the rabbi of Rasha, Rabbi Aaron Lewin, about possibly arranging a marriage between his daughter, who was raised in Amsterdam, knew Dutch, French, German, Hebrew, spoke not a word of Polish, of course, and the son of the Rasha Rav, who, he understood, spoke German, some French, certainly Polish. He had written articles in Polish, Hebrew, and Rabbi Meir Shapiro, on his return to Poland, made this suggestion. And that's how my parents met and married. They didn't have a common language other than German. My mother did not know Polish. My father did not know Dutch, and my mother had not been raised in her home. They didn't speak Yiddish, although my father was very fluent in Yiddish and had written in Yiddish, but their common language was German. They got married in 1935, and at the suggestion of Naftali Sternheim, they settled in the city of Lodz. They had no prior connection to Lodz, but Naftali Sternheim owned some textile mills in Lodz and thought it would be a good idea if his new son-in-law was at least nominally in charge of textile mills. My father knew about as much about textile mills as he knew about computers, which were not yet created, but had no knowledge of how to run a textile mill, but nonetheless, satisfying his father-in-law's desires, moved to Lodz. And I was born there January 31, 1936. I frankly have no recollection whatever of my early years in Lodz. There was a time many years later when we traveled, my wife and my daughters and I, with my father to Poland, and he found the apartment that we lived in and where I was born. I was actually born at home I had stories from my mother about the hairy midwife who was responsible for my birth in Lodz. But I was born January 31, 1936, and spent my early years in Lodz. I have a photograph, which I think can be attached later on, of my parents looking at me as a newborn baby in the town of Lodz. But I have no recollection of the town, of the city itself, or of living there. I just heard after that when I was 3 years old, it was 1939, my mother, who being very well read and very current with the news, and she kept up with what was going on around the world, and particularly in Germany, and what Hitler was doing in Germany. She knew all about Kristallnacht. She knew about the threats that Hitler would be marching into Poland. My father, after he moved to Lodz, after we settled in Lodz, was very promptly elected to the city council of Lodz, because the Jews knew the name Levin, or it's called Lewin here in the United States, Lewin, but spelled Lewin in Polish, it was pronounced Levine. So my father kept the spelling after we came to the United States. But everybody knew about Rav Aaron Levine, the Reisha Rav, and about his son, Isaac, who was my father. So he was promptly elected by the Jews of Lodz to the Lodz City Council. And he published articles in which he reprinted some of the exchange, the colloquy on the floor of the Lodz City Council, in which there was outspoken anti-Semitism, about the same as there is in the United States today, except in those days, the interesting thing was that the anti-Semites on the Lodz City Council were saying, Jews, go to Palestine. Jews, we want you to leave Poland and go to Palestine. And my father would have to respond, as he did in these exchanges, to the anti-Semites on the Lodz City Council, who were very open in their hatred of the Jews. My mother, as I said, was current with what was going on in Germany and with the threats that Hitler was making. Well, in September of 1939, when I was 3 years old, my parents were in Lodz, and visiting at the time in September of 1939 were my mother's parents and sibling, both her father, Naftali Sternheim, her mother, Rachel Sternheim, Rachel Lieber Sternheim was her maiden name, and her brother, her younger brother, Leo or Levi Sternheim. They were all with us in Lodz. I was told this later on. I obviously have no personal recollection of it. But what happened was, when the danger of Hitler coming into Poland became real, my grandfather, Naftali Sternheim, said, we realized it was likely that we would have to leave Poland. And he knew that he had diamonds in Amsterdam. And he decided that he would fly back to Amsterdam, pick up the diamonds, and then come back to join us in Lodz. So he left, and I was told he took a commercial flight from Warsaw to Amsterdam in 1939 and came back, and cousins of mine who recall and were there personally, they watched, they told me, as in Amsterdam, they sewed diamonds into the lining of his coat so that he was going to leave Amsterdam and hopefully be able to get back to us in Lodz or wherever we would go when we would flee Poland. The sad part of the story is that he had the diamonds sewn into his coat. They saw him off on a train with the expectation that he would be able to smuggle into Switzerland at that point, and from Switzerland be able to join us, because there apparently was a location where the train would stop, and it was known that smugglers were available to take you across the border into Switzerland. For some reason that's still mysterious, he did not get off the train at that point. He may have slept, he may have overslept, but somehow he ended up getting off the train at the next stopping point and was arrested by the Swiss guards at that border point and handed over to the Germans. And he ended up in Auschwitz and was murdered there in Auschwitz. That was Naftali Sternheim. My mother told me, and I heard subsequently from her, not a lot of details about our trip to the United States, but some. I don't recall much of the actual escape we made from Poland. Apparently, my father, being on the Lodz City Council, told my mother that he would agree that we should try to smuggle over the border into Lithuania, which meant our taking a train from Lodz across Poland to the Lithuanian border, and then going over in the middle of the night because there was a contested border between Poland and Lithuania at the time. And we would go over the contested border in the middle of the night. You'd have to pay smugglers to take you across. So I was told. I really don't think I have a distinct recollection about it, but I was told that as a 3-year-old, we made it on the train to the Lithuanian border. Of course, my father had told my mother that because of his responsibility with the Lodz City Council, once we were in Lithuania, he would go back to Lodz, and because he was on an emergency committee of some kind that had been formed in case Hitler invaded. He was luckily never able to do that because the trains across Poland were quickly disrupted when the Germans marched in September of 1939. So it was impossible for him to make it back to Lodz. We went across the border in the middle of the night, and I heard that story many times from my mother. And I also heard it from a man who carried me across the border when I was 3 years old. I was told I was 3 years old I had better make no noise, and this is a story that was repeated to me because there were wolves in the forest and they would eat me up if I made any noise. So I kept quiet, and I was carried across by a man. Again, I don't have a distinct recollection, but I heard that story so often, by a man with a long red beard who was a friend of the family, lived with us in Lodz, and stayed as a friend of the family and very close to my parents for years later. I do remember this man when he was in our home in New York. He did have a long red beard, and he ultimately made it to the United States the same way we did. His name was Shopsa Frankel. Now, Shopsa Frankel always had this ambition to publish a comprehensive edition of Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. And he made it to the United States, was a successful businessman in the United States, and actually did publish a multi-volume edition, the bottom of which says, Mahaduras Shabsa Frankel, the Shabsa Frankel edition. All the yeshivas today have this very comprehensive set of the Rambam of Maimonides, and that was the man with the big red beard who carried me across the border into Lithuania. So that's how we made it out of Poland and were not caught by the Nazis in Lodz or in the Lodz ghetto. My grandfather, on the other hand, he was also at that time, initially when the war broke out, in Rasha, in Rzeszów, which was in western Poland. And Hitler was overrunning western Poland. So my grandfather and my grandmother fled from Rasha, Rzeszów, in order to avoid the Nazis, into what was the Russian sector of Poland, which was eastern Poland, to Lvov, what the Jews call Lemberg, where my great-great-grandfather, the Beis Yitzchak, had been the chief rabbi. And my grandfather's brother was a rabbi also in Lvov. So my grandfather fled to Lvov, to Lemberg, to his daughter's home in Lemberg, because he had a daughter who married a guy who was a doctor and settled in Lemberg. So that's where he was during the first years of the war. And we made efforts, my father made constant efforts to try to get documentation or some other way of getting his father and his mother rescued from Lvov, from Nazi occupation during the war. And he didn't know. The truth is, we went through the entire war without knowing what had happened to my father's parents. He had hoped that his father and mother had survived the war. And he spent the entire war thinking that maybe they still were alive, and didn't learn until after the war was over that my grandfather, the famous Rasha Rav, who had been a member of the Polish parliament, had actually been murdered in a pogrom in Lvov in June and beginning of July of 1941, when the Russian troops left Lvov and the Germans came in. And the Ukrainians took that opportunity, anti-Semites that they were, and they hated the Jews anyway, they took that opportunity to murder thousands of Jews in Lvov, including my grandfather. My grandmother survived that onslaught and hid in Lvov, but she and a daughter of hers, who was a sister of my father's, were hidden in Lvov and then were disclosed and taken off to Belzec, where both of them were murdered. But that's how we got to Lithuania, which is the first chapter of our survival during the Shoah, during the terrible Holocaust.
Next stage of your escape route, and can you please share with us the role your mother played in getting transit visas, exit visas, documentation so that you were able to escape Vilna and make your way to Japan?
We made it to Vilna, and my mother, with the information she had, felt that that was not a safe location, that was going to be attacked by Hitler as well as Poland had, because Poland had really fallen. I mean, Poland by then was no longer even recognized as a separate government. We had Polish passports because my father was born in Wieliczka in Poland, not far from Warsaw. And my mother, although she'd been born in Poland, had become a Dutch citizen when her father was granted Dutch citizenship. In those days, that was not so easy. You didn't become a Dutch citizen very easily, but he had managed to make it. So my mother had been a Dutch citizen, but under the law that was then applicable, if a Dutch citizen woman married a Polish man, she became a Polish citizen and lost her Dutch citizenship. So there we were in Vilna with my father a Polish citizen, I a Polish citizen, my mother a Polish citizen because of marriage, and her mother and her brother still Dutch citizens. My mother said, we can't stay here in Vilna. There was a large population of people who had escaped from Poland from Hitler and had managed to make it to Vilna. But the question was, where did you go when you tried to leave Vilna? And my mother felt that since her mother and her brother were Dutch citizens, a safe place to go was the Dutch East Indies, Java, Sumatra. If we could make it there, at that point, we thought that would be all right. That was still 1940. Japanese were not in the World War. They were not necessarily friendly, but Jews were not being treated badly by the Japanese. So my mother's idea was, let's all go to the Dutch East Indies. Even though we were Polish and only her mother and her brother were Dutch. So she approached the Dutch consul in Kaunas, a town that Jews called Kovno, which was the capital of Lithuania. It was close to Vilna. It was not a long trip from Vilna to Kaunas. And she actually spoke to the Dutch consul, not ambassador, but the consul. His name was Jan Zwartendijk. He was a businessman who would have been appointed to be the Dutch consul in Kaunas and Kovno. And she presented to him her theory that we should all be able to travel to the Dutch East Indies. However, because of the danger of Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch government had foreclosed the possibility of any non-Dutch citizen traveling to the Dutch East Indies. And Jan Zwartendijk informed my mother that since my father and she and I were now Polish citizens, we would not be able to go and enter the Dutch East Indies. My mother was temporarily frustrated by that, but she knew he was only a consul, not an ambassador, and therefore she could go higher in the hierarchy. So she wrote. In those days, mail was being delivered. It was sent. You sent a letter, and it came. She sent a letter to the Dutch ambassador, it's higher than the Dutch consul, in Riga, whose name was De Decker. And she asked Ambassador De Decker whether we could not all travel to the Dutch East Indies because there were at least 2 Dutch citizens in the family. And he responded to her, no, because you're Polish, you can't go, only the Dutch citizens can go. But if you like, you can go to the Dutch West Indies. to Curacao or Sumatra, which is off South America, also a Dutch possession, because our restriction does not apply to the Dutch West Indies. And if the governor allows you in, even without a visa, you can stay there. My mother said, "That's very nice." She replied in a letter to Mr. De Decker, "Will you please put this into my Polish passport, that I do not need a visa to go to Sumatra or Curacao. You don't have to say the governor can let you in. I don't need that. Just say you don't need a visa to go to Sumatra or Curacao." And she sent her passport and my father's, I guess, and mine, whatever it was, to Riga. And De Decker actually wrote that in French on our passports. No visa needed for Sumatra and Curacao. She took that, and we had a Lithuanian travel document. Our Polish passports were useless at that point, but we had a Lithuanian travel document called a leidimas, which was a travel document that was given to people in Lithuania, and particularly to Jews who were just there because they had escaped from Poland, so that you could use it to travel. So this is the document that she gave to Jan Zwartendijk. It has a picture of my mother and me and my father, and she asked him to write on that leidimas the very same French notation that De Decker had put into her passport. The consulate of the Netherlands in Kaunas declares, this is in French, that no visa is needed for Suriname, Curacao, and other possessions in America. That was on the 22nd of July, 1940. And my mother went with this document to the Japanese consul, because the theory was to get to Suriname and Curacao from Vilna, you would have to go through Japan. So she went to the Japanese consul, whose name was Juni Sugihara, who is now among the righteous Gentiles in Yad Vashem, as is Jan Zwartendijk, by the way. I mean, I wrote correspondence to Yad Vashem urging that Jan Zwartendijk be recognized as a righteous Gentile also, and he's in Yad Vashem. And Juni Sugihara hand wrote out on the 26th of July, 1940, a transit visa which enabled us to travel from Vilna by Trans-Siberian Railroad to Japan. The Jewish community in Japan, in Kobe, had, after the war broke out, after Hitler ended up producing lots of Jewish refugees from Poland, the Jewish community in Kobe had established a mechanism for welcoming Jews who were fleeing from Hitler. And we traveled from Vilna to Moscow, and from Moscow on Trans-Siberian Railroad all the way to Vladivostok. That was, I'm told, a 3-week trip. And we took that trip and then a boat from Vladivostok to Kobe, ultimately, to Yokohama and then to Kobe, so that at the age of 4, I was in Japan. That was in 1940. And in Japan, the question was, where do you go from Japan? We were all there. my mother, my father, myself, my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, and her brother. They were Dutch citizens and are so listed on the list of Sugihara visas. They're listed as Dutch citizens. But we went from Vladivostok to Kobe, and in Kobe, since my father was well known and his father had been well known, there were Jewish organizations in the United States that requested the State Department to issue visas that would enable these famous rabbis to come to the United States, to enter the United States. And in 1941, the State Department did issue permissions for us to come, for my father, my mother, and myself to come to the United States. Because of U.S. immigration laws, we didn't come as immigrants. We came as parolees, really, coming in under special permission. The letter that was sent to the head of Agudas Israel in the United States, to Michael Tress, authorized, stating that we had been gotten permission, appears in the biography of Tress, which I have in my library, and it says, we have today issued permission to Isaac Lewin and Nathan Lewin and family, which was my mother, to come to the United States. So we did. At that point, my mother, with her mother and brother in Kobe, my mother decided that we should go, my father and I should go travel to the United States, and she would stay in Japan with her mother and brother to try to bring them over together with her to come to the United States. So my father and I came to the United States by boat from Yokohama to San Francisco in March, I think, of 1941. In March of 1941, my father and I arrived in the United States. I was then 5 years old. My mother stayed in Japan, in Kobe, at that point, in efforts to get her brother and mother from there to the United States. That did not succeed. And ultimately, she came to the United States independently, also by boat, first to San Francisco and then across the United States to New York, where my father and I had gone after we arrived in the United States. But for a period of time, I was in the United States with my father and beginning to learn English. My father wrote to my mother regularly. Again, mail was being delivered. Wrote to my mother regularly to Japan, and I happened to have a letter in which he wrote to her in German, because that was they're still their common language, that I was learning English. And I was saying to people, I'm 5 years old and I know 6 languages, because I had learned, not only started with Polish and German and Japanese and Hebrew and English and Dutch at that point. I knew 6 languages at the age of 5. I've forgotten most of those, but that's where I was and was raised in the United States.
What became of your maternal grandmother and your Uncle Leo?
Since my maternal grandmother and my Uncle Leo were not given permission to come to the United States, they did choose as Dutch citizens to go to the Dutch East Indies. And they traveled to the Dutch East Indies. By then, they had obviously lost contact with my maternal grandfather, who may have been exterminated, deceased, murdered. But anyway, the two of them went to Java and spent the war years there under Japanese occupation. They were viewed as enemy citizens. My uncle, as a matter of fact, joined the Dutch military and died on an island, died of some illness in uniform on an island off of Java, and is buried there. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, survived the war and came and lived with us in the United States a couple of years after the war when she was released. And we made contact and she came to America.
What was it like for you with all the dislocation and then finding yourself in the United States with your father, but your mother being far away?
Well, it was difficult. My father, we traveled across the United States from San Francisco. We stopped at temporarily at locations where my father had made associations before the war broke out. Rabbi Eichenstein of St. Louis, for example, was one name that he knew and dealt with, corresponded with prior to the war. So my father and I spent some time in St. Louis. Then we came to the United States. He took an apartment in Williamsburg when we were just alone. And then when my mother came, she decided that the place for us to live was the west side of Manhattan. So we took an apartment in the upper west side of Manhattan. And that's where I grew up in New York. I became a real Yankee. My parents, in terms of their speaking to each other at home, learned English because German, which was their common language at that point, was a hated language. When they walked in the street, even though my father was obviously Jewish, he had a beard, and he's so obviously Jewish, but if people heard you speaking German in the streets, they would stop, and the attitude towards people speaking in German was one of total hatred. The Nazis and the Germans were the enemy. So I grew up in a home where, as I learned English, my parents learned English. My father's natural language was Polish, but that was of very little use in the United States. But he also had written in Yiddish. He wrote many books and articles, take up a complete shelf of the library that I have here at home, all the books he wrote, collected addresses, articles in Yiddish. He took a job first when he came as a journalist, a Yiddish journalist. He would regularly write for the Yiddish newspapers and tried to alert the American community, Yiddish-speaking community, to what was going on in Europe. Ultimately, he published some of his articles under the title of Churban Europa, the destruction of Europe, because he was among the very earliest ones who was telling American Jews that Jews were being annihilated by Hitler. And he wrote these articles screaming really at the Jewish community and at leaders of American Jewry, like Stephen Wise. My father, because he was a European rabbi who was learning English but was educated and was known as, not as Rabbi Lewin, although he had smicha, but as Dr. Lewin, because he had a doctor of laws. So he was respected and invited, and he would be a lone voice frequently when Stephen Wise or the others were with Franklin Roosevelt, sort of quieting down American attitude about Germany.
Was what was happening to Jews in Europe spoken about in your home?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, they were, my father was very active with Vad Hatzalah, with the efforts to save Jews. He was among the very first rabbis who went to Europe after the war was over. He made 2 trips almost shortly after the war was over. One with Rabbi Eliezer Silver, which was covered substantially by the media, and another one on behalf of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association. Not UNRW, but 2 R's and then an A. He put on the uniform. He was very proud to have a uniform that he would travel over to Europe in an American uniform and try to help the Jews, the She'erit HaPleita, the ones who were left from this terrible massacre of Jews in Europe. So he was among the very first. And I grew up knowing that, a good part of the day, my father would be on the phone with the other members of Vad Hatzalah. He was up till all hours of the night typing his articles in Yiddish and ultimately in English. As I was learning English, as I learned English in New York, he would give me his articles in English for me to correct and to make revisions. So I would spend time trying to help him with these articles. He was a believer, much as it sounds incredible today. He was a believer in the United Nations. He was really a close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very active at the UN, and he believed that the world united in the United Nations could stamp out anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. He was, although very supportive of Jews in Israel, he was not a Zionist. He was a member of the Aguda, and the Aguda in Poland was really in some ways non-Zionist. I mean, they believed that, religion where it was performed in Poland and carried out was the right way. And if not for Hitler, this was a center of Jewish learning. So although he was supportive of Israel and applauded Israel's creation, I mean, the truth is, my father was the only extreme right-wing Aguda member who had a law degree and legal background. And I do recall sitting in my home in New York, sitting at home in New York, and a frequent visitor would be Levine, who was the head of the Aguda in Israel. And he would be in our home, and I heard him tell my father that if he came to Israel, he would be appointed by the Aguda to the Israeli Supreme Court because they needed somebody on the Supreme Court of Israel who would represent the right wing, the Haredi, the Torah community. And there was no one, there was no lawyer who was an Aguda member. And the Aguda, had my father agreed to move to Israel when it was first established, he would have been the appointee to the first Israeli Supreme Court. But for various personal reasons, including my mother's preferences, we were not ready to move to Israel. My father and my mother were not ready to move to Israel. So we stayed in the United States. But my father was recognized by Yitzchak Meir Levine, Itcha Meir Levine, who, as I say, I remember him coming to our home in New York frequently when he came to America. He was the head of the Aguda in Israel, and he told my father that if he came to Israel, he would be on the Supreme Court of Israel because he was the only lawyer they had. And they ended up appointing somebody to the Supreme Court of Israel to represent the Aguda who had no legal education, had no formal legal study.
Can you share with us what it was like for you as a young boy to land in America and to become an Amerikaner, become an American?
Boy, it was terrific. I loved it. I became an avid sports fan. That was all I was interested in, was baseball, hockey. I remember, the most exciting things were going to a baseball game, going to a hockey match, going to a basketball game, New York Knickerbocker fan, New York Ranger fan, New York Yankee fan. I mean, I spent all my time looking at the sports pages. I wasn't interested in whatever else was going on in the world other than the sports pages and the comics. My parents would go up. There were a couple of big newsstands on the west side of Manhattan where we lived. And I remember my father going there, picking up the Times, the Sun, the Herald Tribune. I mean, all the local newspapers, the Jewish papers, the Aufbau, the Yiddish newspapers. He would write for the Morgenjournal, but would occasionally buy the Tug, never the Farverts, because that was apikarsis. That was out of bounds. And when they would do that, I would look through the comics. Captain Marvel, that was fantastic. Captain Marvel comics, I would eagerly await their coming out. They cost a dime in those days, 10 cents, big expense. But I could not miss an issue of Captain Marvel and Marvel comics. And that's what I spent my childhood as I was growing up. I went to a school at my mother's insistence, to a very modern day school, Ramaz, which had been formed relatively recently, was on the east side of Manhattan. Rabbi Joseph Lookstein was then the rabbi of Gil Jeshurun, which was the synagogue on the east side, and they had a school bus. I was an only child. My parents were very protective. My mother was very protective. And the notion of being able to be picked up by a school bus and not go on public transportation, they were not going to trust me on public transportation. So I went on a school bus to Ramaz, and I had a terrific education there. They had an excellent secular department, phenomenal Hebrew language, and the only shortcoming was they did not do enough Talmudic learning, enough yeshiva study. So my father hired a young man who was in the Smicha program at Yeshiva University to come to the house a couple of days a week and learn Gemara with me. But beyond that, the education was phenomenal. I loved it. I had very good friends who went to school there. And as I say, through elementary school, I went there on the school bus. In the summers, since I was an only child, I really wanted to spend the time playing baseball, swimming, being with others. So although my parents would travel during the summer, sometimes even to Europe or ultimately to Israel, I resisted that. I told them I want to go to camp because in camp I was independent and I could play ball.
Okay. So, what was the rest of your education like after the Ramaz school?
Well, Ramaz, as I said, was my mother's inclination to have a very modern Jewish education. That's why we lived on the west side of Manhattan, and it was under her influence that I did not go to a traditional yeshiva and down on the east side or something like that, but went to Ramaz. My father, by that time already, by the time I graduated Ramaz, had made close contact with the president of Yeshiva University, Samuel Belkin, who became a good friend of my father's. And my father had joined the faculty of Yeshiva University, and as a matter of fact, had become the principal of a girls' high school, which was initially formed by the owner of Barton's Candy, Stephen Klein, and who, together with Dr. Belkin, persuaded my father to become the Hebrew principal of the girls' high school. That girls' high school, then known as Central High School, is the one that my wife Ricky attended, also in Brooklyn, and my father was the Hebrew principal. So by the time I graduated Ramaz, it was clear that I was not going to be continuing with their high school, but going to the Yeshiva University High School. That required me to take the subway every day from our West Side apartment up to Washington Heights, and I began doing that in high school. There was only, I think, one other member of our graduating class at Ramaz that actually went to Yeshiva University High School, which was then called Tom Yurkel Academy. And I began there in 1949, I guess, when I was 13 years old, after my bar mitzvah. My bar mitzvah was on the west side of Manhattan, in a hotel there. My only memory of the bar mitzvah really is that my father taught me to give a drasha, a pshatel in Yiddish, and I gave it in Yiddish, my pshatel, for my bar mitzvah, even though Yiddish was not a language that I was learning in school, but my father was writing in it, and he taught me to give that in Yiddish. So I gave the pshatel in Yiddish at a hotel on the west side of Manhattan where my bar mitzvah took place. I was still so small, short in terms of size, that my recollection only is I started giving this pshatel, and then they were yelling from the crowd to put me on a chair so that they would see me as I was delivering it. So I delivered it. And my father was very proud that I was able to do it. This was part of a drasha that appears in my grandfather's book called Avnei Chayfetz, in which he lays out over several pages a long discussion about what you do if you find two pairs of tefillin on Shabbos. There's a Gemara about that and a whole discussion that he has. And that was the drasha that was given by my father and by my uncles. Because again, I haven't mentioned them yet, but my father had two brothers who also survived the war. They came from Poland and made their way through the same route to ultimately to Canada. They were not admitted to the United States, but they traveled to Canada. And the older of the two brothers, who were twins, by the way, settled in Borough Park in Brooklyn. And his son, who passed away a number of years ago, became a very well-known Jewish economist in Yeshiva University, Aaron Levine. Now that uncle kept the pronunciation of Levine, but changed the spelling to Levine. The other uncle, who stayed in Canada, Samuel Lewin, became the executive director of the Canadian Jewish Congress in Montreal. And then ultimately, when he retired from that, went on Aliyah and lived in Israel. So those were my father's two brothers. Again, a sister who was killed by the Nazis in Lvov. At Yeshiva University High School, Talmudical Academy, I was in the regular, not super special, but kind of regular yeshiva program where I went through a number of rebbes, many of whom could only speak Yiddish. So my Yiddish got even better when I went to Talmudical Academy. But I was interested at that point in continued interest in sports, but became a kind of a campus politician. I ran for president of my class and president of the student council, and repeatedly was elected in the high school years. And I did very well academically. I got very good grades in all my courses and was, quite frankly, a very obedient and law-abiding young man in high school. If the few times that our class did things that were disruptive that I participated in, the standard response to me was, "Nathan, we're really shocked that even you did this." I mean, but I succeeded there, and in my high school yearbook, I'm listed as the most likely to succeed, and that ended up being not such an empty thing, because although my wife is not here right now to comment on it, she tells the story of how she first became aware of me when, with her class at Central High School, they were coming up to take the exams in Washington Heights, and they saw the yearbook, and there was a Nathan Lewin who was listed as most likely to succeed. And she was very impressed with that and thought that maybe someday she might meet this Nathan Lewin, who was most likely to succeed. But it seemed to have some impact on her, and maybe in some way has led to our successful 62 years marriage. But anyway, so I went through high school. I was valedictorian. I had a successful political career in high school. And then I had some thoughts of maybe going to college outside of yeshiva, maybe continuing with yeshiva studies and learning. But I decided ultimately that it was easier to continue with yeshiva college, which I did. I then went to yeshiva college. The advisor of yeshiva college, first of all, in high school, one thing I was really good at was math. And the advisor in high school told me that the smart thing for me to do would be to continue studying math and become an actuary, because an actuary made a lot of money. And in those days, they said to me, you can be an actuary and you can make $100,000 a year. And I said, oh, that sounds great. But then I went to college and I encountered calculus. And calculus was not to my taste, really. So I went off became an English major in college, again, was a politician, totally successful until with kind of false optimism, ran for president of the student council after I was elected president of my class, secretary treasurer of the student council, thought I couldn't possibly lose running for president, and then was defeated for president. That ended my political career. And instead, in college, I wrote together with two others, Joel Schreiber and Joshua Miller, wrote an original comedy, musical comedy, which took on, of all people, Richard Nixon. We made fun of him in a musical called Choose to Run that we wrote, with original music and lyrics that I wrote, and I directed it. And we had a couple of nights presentation at a Broadway theater that we rented for that purpose, the Barbizon Plaza Theater. And we rented it and actually showed this play with an all-male cast. I mean, we wrote it and I directed it, and it was my effort at theater, which I really loved in those days. I was a dramatics counselor in summer camps because that interested me. And that's how I went through Yeshiva College. I was valedictorian there too in Yeshiva College. They elected me and I gave a speech. And also the question was, what was I going to do after college? My father had gotten a law degree, and when people asked me, what are you going to do when you grow up? I thought it was an easy thing to say, that you were going to be a lawyer. Early on, I said I was going to be a rabbi, because in those days, with the Korean War going on, you were able to get a 4D, a divinity exception. It wasn't safe, really, to say you were going to do something else, because maybe the draft board would see that and would say, okay, you're drafted. So I originally, for a year or two, said I was going to be a rabbi, but I really didn't want to be a rabbi, although my father believed that it was possible that I could become a leading American rabbi. But I was not inclined that way. So I said I would apply to law schools. And at Yeshiva College in those days, there were a couple of people who had successfully made it to the top law schools in the United States, which were Harvard and Yale. Columbia was well regarded, but it was not in the league of Harvard and Yale. I was very good at taking these exams, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the LSAT, the Law School Aptitude Test. I didn't prepare for them specifically, but they were like puzzles. It was great. I enjoyed doing them. So I took the Law School Aptitude Test, and I did phenomenally well. I mean, amazing result. And I applied to Harvard and Yale because they had accepted Yeshiva College applicants in the past. And I was admitted to Harvard and to Yale. And when I thought about what I was going to do, I figured, well, I'll go to Yale because Yale is closer to New York, and I'll be able to come home frequently for Shabbos. Just get on the train and be an hour or something, I'd be home. Boston seemed too far away. So at my graduation, I remember I delivered the valedictory address, and the father of a classmate of mine, this fellow Josh Miller, with whom I had written this play, said to me at the time, Nathan, you've done so well. What are you going to do with yourself? now that you're finishing college? And he was a lawyer. He was a practicing lawyer in Haverstraw, New York. And I said to him, Mr. Miller, I said very proudly, I'm going to go to law school. And he said, oh, what law school are you going to? And I said to him, because my father had sent in, I think, $50 to hold my place at Yale. And I said, oh, I'm going to go to Yale Law School. And he said, Yale? Oh, that's very nice. It's too bad you were not admitted to Harvard. And I looked at him and I said, not admitted? I was admitted to Harvard. As a matter of fact, they've offered me a full scholarship. Now, the tuition at Harvard Law School in those days was, believe it or not, $1,000 a year. And it meant living in Boston. And Mr. Miller, who was the only practicing lawyer I knew, said to me, Nathan, if you are admitted to the Harvard Law School and you don't go to Harvard, you are crazy. He used those words. That's what he said to me. And I thought to myself, the only lawyer I know says to me I'm crazy if I don't go to the Harvard Law School. So I went home and I said to my father, look, maybe I should go to Harvard. And my father said to me, well, Harvard is in Boston, isn't it? I said, yes. And he said, you can't get kosher meat in Boston, can you? I said, I think you can. And I checked, and I discovered that there were 3 other graduates of Yeshiva College who were attending Harvard. One at the Harvard Law School, his name was Arnold Enker, who was still alive, and I think he was the first dean of the Bar Ilan Law School in Israel. And he offered me a job at Bar Ilan years and years ago, which I turned down because he told me I could only come in as an assistant professor. But anyway, one was Arnold Enker, and then there were 2 others. One was Sam Danishevsky, who almost won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. He did amazing things, and he was in the graduate school at Harvard in chemistry. And a third one was a fellow by the name of Arnold Knoll, Knoll, who was, I think, in physics at Harvard. And I checked, and the 3 of them were sharing an apartment and looking for a 4th roommate. And I said, oh, that's great. They keep kosher. They have a kosher apartment in Cambridge. And I told that to my father, and ultimately he agreed that I could go to Boston. I went to Harvard under those circumstances in this kosher apartment, and that's where I learned how to shop, how to cook, there were 4 of us. We put a schedule up on the board. Each day somebody would go shopping, somebody would cook, somebody would wash the dishes, and the 4th person was off for the day. So we had a regular schedule. There were no really big freezers in those days, just a little ice cube compartment in the refrigerator. So you couldn't buy a lot of stuff and freeze it. You had to go shopping almost every day to the grocery. So we did that. And I went to the Harvard Law School under those circumstances. And it was an eye-opening experience. I mean, Harvard Law School, really, even after all the years at yeshiva and learning Gemara, with leading Rosh Yeshiva, leading Rabbanim, Harvard Law School, I think, taught me for the first time how to really think independently. I mean, I would go to class, and I would read the cases, and then I would listen to the discussion in class and think about it. And boy, I began to think, you can really think on your own, which I frankly did not do when I was learning Gemara in yeshiva. I was able to regurgitate what I was told and what Rishonim and Achronim said and all that. But here, for the first time in Harvard Law School, I actually thought. So I went through the first year at Harvard Law School, as a innocent, timid Jewish kid. And there was a very large Jewish population at Harvard, but not very many Orthodox Jews. I already did not wear a yarmulke. I mean, when my father went to the UN, for example, he did not deliver speeches in a yarmulke. And so he was not insistent that I wear a yarmulke in class or at law school, so I didn't. But I found myself in a very small minority of observant Jewish kids at the Harvard Law School. And I recall still on about the first week that we were students at Harvard Law School, we were told in class this afternoon, go down to the gym. We're going to they have to do a quick physical of you. And, as you go down. So I went down to the gym with all these other kids. And they say, take off your shirt. I took off my shirt. And under my shirt, I had my tzitzis. And the line progresses, and I come to the head of the line. And the guy's there with the doctor with a stethoscope. And he says, what are you wearing? I say, it's called tzitzis. He says, what is that? I say, it's a religious article of clothing for under Jewish law. He says, oh. He says, where did you go to school? I said, Yeshiva College. He says, so for the first time in your education, you're in a school with non-Jewish kids. I said, I guess that's right. He said, how do you feel about that, being among non-Jews? And I recall saying, I can't tell the difference in this class between the Jews and the non-Jews, because I was in a very small minority of observant Jews who were wearing tzitzis. But the Jews and the non-Jews were not observant. Harvard was then a 6-day-a-week law school where classes were on Saturday, so we had to get a special arrangement in which if you were Sabbath observant, you would have only one class on Saturdays instead of 2 or 3, which would otherwise be set for your schedule. So I was put into that special section, which only had one class on Saturdays. It was at 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturdays. So we arranged to have the minyan, which was at the Harvard Divinity School in those days. There was no Hillel House at Harvard in those days. But in the Divinity School, we arranged to start at about 7:30 so that those of us who had to go to this class, there was one other fellow from Yeshiva College who made it to Harvard Law School with me, and we went running to make it to that class at 10 o'clock. And we would sit in the back of the class, obviously with no notes and no books, and just listen, which I found very educational. And I was told by people later on, years later, that the students in the class would wonder about this genius who was able to sit in class in the back of his class with no books and no notes on Saturdays. But that's what it was like at Harvard. But where you were at Harvard ended up depending on how you did on the exams. And I did phenomenally well on the first year exams and placed 5th in a class of about 475. And that qualified me for an invitation to the Harvard Law Review, which I served on for those second and third years at the Harvard Law School.
So now you've come to the...
1 second. Could you fix your tie?
Yes, I meant to.
Sorry.
Yeah, if we're not, are we on break? I mean,
I'll fix this.
okay. Good, because I wanted to say something. So now we'll. Do you feel the need to get up and stretch or
No.
no? Okay. So now I guess we'll turn to your career choices and how you got a clerkship in the Court of Appeals, and then you clerked for Justice Harlan. So go over that territory. And I'm especially interested in how you, despite having a secular legal education and a specialization in constitutional law, how you found yourself taking on so many cases that had to do with civil rights and freedoms for Jews. And was any of that a result of your father's influence? So if you could speak to that.
Sure.
So what was the next step after graduating from Harvard Law School?
Well, let me get to before graduating Harvard Law School. I made it to the Harvard Law Review in a class that for many years, and maybe even today, is considered one of the very famous, outstanding classes at the Harvard Law School. It ended up having people, not only Michael Dukakis, who ran for president and did not make it to the Harvard Law Review, but a number of other people who made it to very high positions in government. On the Harvard Law Review, because I was a Sabbath observer, I was unusual because I couldn't be available from Friday sundown to on Saturday. And yet, the people I worked with seemed to appreciate my work and what I did, because the Harvard Law Review in those days, I think it's still true today, elects its own officers. They were responsible for issuing a publication every month, which was a thick book of legal essays and comments on recent cases and movements in the law and book reviews. And the officers of that publication were a president who was in charge of the whole thing, then officers who were in charge of articles, notes, things like that. But right after the president was what they called the treasurer, who was the managing editor, who was responsible for seeing that everything on the galleys and all that was accurate. And although I was only available 6 days a week, my classmates on the Harvard Law Review elected me to the position of managing editor, which was called treasurer. And I viewed that as a singular distinction, that my classmates, who were top brilliant students at the Harvard Law School, thought so much of me that they would vote me into that office. Of course, I spent a lot of time working at the Harvard Law Review, as in addition to taking classes. And the end of the at the end of the second year, you were able to get clerkships. In those days, you weren't able to get much at the end of the first year, so I went back to being a dramatics counselor at camp at the end of my first year. But for my second summer, I thought I certainly qualified for an internship at one of the New York law firms, which I was absolutely astounded when I visited them to see how magnificent they were. The offices were terrific. The views you had, it was very high class. So I applied. Some of them in those days were very open about the fact that they would not take anybody who's Jewish period, Jewish. And they said it openly because this was before the Civil Rights Act. They could say, we don't want any Jewish partners, period. There were other firms that didn't say that either invited you to apply or that came up to Harvard in the Harvard Law Review building, which was called Gannett House, and did interviews there for summer jobs. Of those law firms, I still did not get a job because I said, even though I was not wearing a yarmulke, but I said, I'm a Sabbath observer. And they said, we can't afford to hire somebody. Even the Jewish firms said, we can't afford to hire somebody who will not be available from sundown on Friday and on Saturday, even for a summer job, because that was an entree to permanent position as an associate in the law firm. So we're not interested in you, no matter how good your record is at Harvard. So I couldn't get a job for the summer after my second year at law school, notwithstanding the fact I was in the top 10 of my class by then. Luckily, there was a professor at Harvard by the name of Benjamin Kaplan, Jewish, who was looking for a research associate for the summer, and he put up notices on that. I applied for it, and he hired me as his research associate for that summer. And we got along famously. I mean, I did a lot of work for him. He very much appreciated the work I did, thought it was apparently first class. And it turned out that because I did not get a job in my second summer, I ended up getting a clerkship at the Supreme Court. How did that happen? Well, when I graduated Harvard, everybody who was in the Law Review, except, by the way, Nino Scalia, who was an officer of the Law Review, and who got married just as we ended law school, and he decided rather than clerking for a justice or a judge, he would prefer to go traveling around the world. So there was and there still is, I think, a Sheldon Traveling Fellowship for a graduate of the Harvard Law School that pays you for traveling, period. So he and his wife went off on a Sheldon Traveling Fellowship. I wanted to be a law clerk, and I applied, did not get a Supreme Court clerkship when I graduated. Got a clerkship in the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit because of my grades. Really, the professor who made those recommendations to the chief judge of the Court of Appeals was not one I particularly knew or was friendly with, or that I thought necessarily held highly of me. But because I was an officer of the Law Review and high up in the class, he recommended me, together with another graduate of our class, to be a law clerk on the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And as a matter of fact, I served in kind of a position that made me a law clerk to judges who were just about retired but showed up only occasionally. That's why this chief judge had 2 law clerks. So I clerked that year in New York. And I worked in the Court of Appeals. The judge I worked for, Judge Lombard, was chief judge of the Court of Appeals. No great legal scholar, but very appreciative and very accommodating to my religious observance. And suddenly, in the middle of that year, I get a call from a professor at Harvard who I did not know personally, Professor Bator, B-A-T-O-R, who had been a law clerk to Justice John Harlan on the Supreme Court, and who Harlan had designated as being the one who should recommend for him a graduate of the Harvard Law School to serve as his law clerk. And Bator says to me, total surprise to me, Nathan, do you want to be a law clerk on the Supreme Court? I said, of course I want. He says, well, I'm recommending you, and apparently it was on the recommendation of Professor Kaplan, I'm recommending you to be the law clerk for Justice Harlan. You have to go down to Washington, travel down there, meet with him, and if you and he get along, then you'll be his law clerk, one of his 2 law clerks next year. The other one is from some other law school because Harlan was really distributing these positions and was going to take another law clerk from another law school, but was relying on Bator. So I went down to Washington and I met with Justice Harlan. Because of my experience with the law firms, I was very concerned that Harlan would say to me, as some of the Jewish law firms had said, I can't hire somebody who's not available Friday afternoons and Saturdays. But I thought I have to tell Harlan about my inability to work at that time and on Jewish holidays. So I came down, I met with Justice Harlan. He was an amazing man. I mean, not only brilliant and articulate, but so very cordial. I met with him. We talked for a while. We seemed to get along. And then I said to him, well, Justice Harlan, I have to tell you that I'm Orthodox Jewish, and for that reason, I can't work on Friday afternoons after sundown or on Saturdays or Jewish holidays. And he immediately, without any hesitation, said to me, that's not a problem. Are you available on Sundays? I said, of course I'm available on Sundays. He said, okay, I have 2 law clerks. The other law clerk will be around Saturdays, and you'll be around on Sundays. We'll have a 7-day-a-week office. I said, terrific. So I rented an apartment, which was on Capitol Hill, southeast, walking distance from the Supreme Court. And I worked for Justice Harlan that year. It was an amazing experience. Justice Harlan, of course, was the grandson of the first John Harlan, who was the famous dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson, who said separate is not equal. You can't separate black people out because of the color of their skin. So Harlan had a huge portrait of his grandfather in his chambers. And I told him about my grandfather. And my co-clerk, whose name was John Rhinelander, who later made a reputation for himself also, was a sub-cabinet officer in the Reagan administration, was the grandson of the Episcopalian or some archbishop. And also he had a distinguished grandfather. And Harlan frequently, if he had visitors and brought them in to meet his law clerks, would come in more than once and say, I'd like you to meet my law clerks, who are also grandchildren of famous people. Here's Nat Lewin, who's the grandson of one of the chief rabbis in pre-war Poland, and John Rhinelander, who's the grandson of the Archbishop of Pennsylvania. So that was really kind of fun. It was a very monumental year on the Supreme Court. Felix Frankfurter's last year, he had a stroke that year. But Frankfurter was really in some ways close to the Harlan law clerks, and would come on at times and sort of barge into our office, the law clerk's office, to chat with Harlan's clerks, who we viewed as being parallel to his own law clerks. And that year, I lived in Washington as a bachelor, but I had met Ricky and had traveled the year after I graduated law school. I traveled across the country on a scholarship, on a grant, really, that had been provided for a summer program in which you had to write an article that would be published by the Harvard Law Review. And we chose a fellow who was on the Harvard Law Review with me. We agreed to write about anti-discrimination commissions. So we selected locations where there were already anti-discrimination commissions to go and interview them. And he agreed to be kosher with me. We drove across the country with a portable range, sort of, charcoal steaks and hamburgers, and we would stop by the side of the road, and we'd have kosher meals, and we'd spend Shabbos at different locations where we'd go to shul. And by then I had met Ricky, and I was sending her postcards from all these locations, which she enjoyed. And when I began my clerkship, I would see her. And then in Washington as well, she went off to Israel. We continued to correspond. But I, from Washington, would commute up to New York, frequently drive up to New York. She occasionally came down to Washington. As a matter of fact, attended one of the Harlan law clerk reunions that were held that year. We got married at the end of that year, August of 1962. So that's how I spent the year as a law clerk in Washington, as a bachelor law clerk, living, by the way, not only close to the Supreme Court, but close to the Southeast Hebrew congregation. Rabbi Bernstein, Zichrono Livracha, became very close. I would go there, I would daven, I would lane. He took a great interest in me, both personally because we got along very well, but also because he had 4 daughters. But my heart was with Ricky, and we got married at the end of that year. Then settled in Washington. I persuaded her that Washington was better than New York. And because I had also gotten a job offer from the Department of Justice under Robert Kennedy, and that was considered a sort of plum possibility, being a special assistant to an assistant attorney general.
Now you're making decisions not only for yourself, but you have a wife.
Right.
So if you could talk about what did she do in Washington? You dislocated her. If you started family, and then how you chose to pursue your career.
Well, once we were in Washington, we took an apartment which was near the shul, the rabbi of which was a somewhat distant relative, Rabbi Skast, who was married to a sister of my aunt's. I began, commuting to the Department of Justice. Ricky was working at the time. She had been an assistant in New York to a couple of magazines, a secular movie magazine and a Jewish Life magazine. So she had both an interest in photography and an interest in journalism. So she took a job also that involved those interests. And we lived in Washington. Very soon after I began at the Department of Justice, the funny thing was, again, you can't plan your life so well. Nobody would have told me when I started or went through law school that I would ever become a trial lawyer or interested in criminal law. But when I was clerking, the law clerks, many of them who were not going into private practice or teaching, were looking for jobs with the Kennedy Department of Justice. Jack Kennedy had been elected in 1960. His brother became Attorney General. So it seemed to be an exciting time to be in the law on behalf of the government. I applied for various special assistant jobs, but other law clerks sort of beat me out to various things until somebody told me that the criminal division, the assistant attorney general in the criminal division, a fellow by the name of Herbert J. Miller, Jr., Jack Miller, not Jewish, but was looking for a special assistant, a law clerk, who might help him personally with issues that came to him or help him write articles or, do different things. So I applied for that, and I was offered that job. So I took it, even though I was not interested in criminal law particularly. But I took it, and I started working at the Department of Justice. And I worked on some briefs on behalf of the United States, which was kind of standard, which I would have expected, until suddenly Miller called me in and said to me, look, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, is very interested in a criminal case that's going to be tried in Nashville, Tennessee. It's the prosecution of Jimmy Hoffa. And to be frank, although I tried to follow the news, I wasn't even sure who Jimmy Hoffa was. But apparently Bob Kennedy had decided that Hoffa was a national menace and should be prosecuted. And he'd put together a team to prosecute Hoffa. The team consisted of two great trial lawyers, a guy by the name of Jim Neal, another one by the name of Charles Schaffer, and a fellow who was very good at handling documents that were needed for the case. And they needed a kind of legal beagle, a guy who would be able to write legal memoranda, do research and all that. And Miller said to me, okay, I think you ought to go down to Nashville, Tennessee to join this group, these other three lawyers. They need you. We discussed it and decided, okay, we'll do it. So we got in a car, Ricky and I, and drove down to Nashville, Tennessee. The interesting thing is we arrived about 2 days before Yom Kippur, I think. And we arrived in Nashville. The rabbi in Nashville, his name is Zalman Posner, now Colonel Avracha, but his son is very active with Chabad. But the rabbi was Chabad rabbi, but was the Orthodox rabbi in Nashville. Very intellectual, very highly regarded at Vanderbilt University, where he was giving lectures. very respected and a very, very cordial, helpful. We came there. He helped us. We got an apartment in Nashville. I showed up, the day after we came in, and I arrived at the office to introduce myself to my 3 teammates. And they greeted me cordially. They had a whole list of things that they had to do, legal memoranda, all kinds of research, all sorts of stuff that was prepared and that was needed. And I said, sure, I'm going to start on that, but I just want to tell you that the day after tomorrow is the eve of Yom Kippur, and then is Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. The 3 of them, of course, are not Jewish. They were shocked. I said, I don't work on that day. I don't work on Saturdays. He said, right. And then I felt I have to tell them the whole story. And I said, well, after Yom Kippur comes another holiday called Sukkot. There are 2 days there and then another 2 days. I think it turned out that they were not, some of them, fortunately, were weekends, but I don't recall. But I advised them I couldn't work on those days either. And they gulped. And I'm told that night they called up Bob Kennedy and Jack Miller and said, you've sent us a guy who's useless. He's not going to be able to do any work. And Kennedy kind of said, well, let's see what happens. But it turned out that during the entire trial, they thought I was extremely helpful to them. I mean, it was quite an experience going through the Hoffa trial in Nashville. I became not only the legal guy, but the guy who dealt with the local reporter for the Nashville Tennessean, who was a woman who did not understand what was going on in court. It was not an easy case to follow. So I had to sit with her every day and explain what was going on. The truth is, it was a very boring case in court, but Hoffa tried to bribe jurors during that case. He had his whole team with him at his hotel. And in the course of that case, he was telling his close associate, a fellow by the name of Edward Grady Parton, who had been a head of a Teamsters local and who had been criminally prosecuted, but he was confiding in him about what he was doing. And Parton, in turn, was telling that to the government, to Walter Sheridan, who was the head of the Get Hoffa squad in the Department of Justice. This was not legal strategy that he was sharing. It was just the fact that he was trying to bribe jurors. So that information during the trial, which was a long, drawn-out, dull trial, came to the government. And it was very exciting what was done, because we managed to get one juror stricken on the basis of that information. I'm not going to go into the details. And we had 2 jurors stricken, I'm sorry. And, the whole thing is a very interesting story. But ultimately, the jury was a hung jury. They didn't decide whether he was guilty or innocent. But during the trial, when there were legal issues that came up, I would go running out of the courtroom, up to the library, find the cases, which I became expert in doing, bring them back to the courtroom, and Neal or Schaffer would recite the cases and the authorities to the judge. So Hoffa called me Instant Law. That's how I got that title, Instant Law. He thought maybe we were wiretapping him. But what I was doing was actually researching on the spot, and then I wrote legal memorandum. The team appreciated me, as did Bob Kennedy. I mean, I have commendatory letters and other things from Kennedy, and but the case ended up with a hung jury in Nashville. The question then was whether to indict Hoffa for jury bribery or for attempted jury bribery based on what he did. And I came back to Washington. We came back to Washington. I wrote important legal memoranda, I think, which I probably still have in the file somewhere, on the subject. And Hoffa was then indicted in Chattanooga while Kennedy was Attorney General. And they asked me to go down to Chattanooga, which I did, and joined the trial team there. And at this trip, Ricky stayed in Washington for her work and other things, but I went down to Chattanooga. And in this second trial, in which the surprise witness was this guy, Edward Grady Parton, who he had managed to keep secret from Hoffa during all this time. And Hoffa was shocked when Parton testified against him, but the jury found Hoffa guilty, and it was a great victory for Bob Kennedy, for the Department of Justice, and even for the Orthodox community, because in Chattanooga, where I lived, I went to the Orthodox shul, which was a breakaway from a shul that had turned conservative. And the leading lawyer for Hoffa in Chattanooga was a member of the conservative synagogue. So they viewed this as being competition between the Orthodox shul was overjoyed when Hoffa was found guilty, because that proved that the Orthodox won over the conservative. But anyway, that's what I did in Chattanooga, and then came back to Washington after the Chattanooga experience.
What came after the Hoffa trial?
Well, in addition, while I was at the Department of Justice working for the Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division for Jack Miller, my friends, different people I knew, were in the office of the Solicitor General when Archibald Cox was there. And at their recommendation, Cox offered me a position as an assistant to the Solicitor General. And that was a terrific opportunity to be able to argue cases in the Supreme Court, write briefs in the Supreme Court and argue cases. The office then was very small. Today, I think there are 25, maybe 30 assistants, people in the office of the Solicitor General. In those days, the whole office consisted maybe of the Solicitor General and maybe 5 others or 6 others. And I was one of those who Cox asked to join, and I did join. So we had an opportunity to write briefs and to argue cases in the Supreme Court, which was terrific. And that's how I started with a Supreme Court practice while with the government. And I argued cases in the Supreme Court on behalf of the United States. Under Archibald Cox, and then Cox, when Johnson was president, was unhappy about the fact that after Kennedy was assassinated, was unhappy about the fact that the president had given him no recognition, really. And he wrote a letter which he, I think, thought was going to generate a positive response from President Johnson. And instead, Johnson very adroitly turned it into a resignation, effectively, and thanked Cox for his service and appointed Thurgood Marshall to be Solicitor General. And I was in the office at the time as an assistant to this Cox. So Marshall inherited me along with the few other assistants to be working with him. And of course, an interesting story that relates to religion is that when Marshall came in the first day to be Solicitor General, we were told that we should go in and introduce ourselves to the judge. He was then called Judge because he had been a judge on the Court of Appeals. So you waited, and then when your turn came, you were supposed to go in and speak to Marshall, introduce yourself, tell him where you'd gone to school, what you've done, and whatever you thought was important, and have a little chat with the judge. So when my turn came, I came in. We had a little brief conversation. I hadn't met him before, although I clerked on the Second Circuit, but it was before he was on the Second Circuit. So I didn't meet him. And after we had our little discussion, I said to him, as I had said to Harlan, and as I thought was necessary, by the way, Judge, this was kind of late in the year before the holidays. By the way, Judge, I'm Orthodox, which means I have to leave early on Fridays, and then the Jewish holidays are coming up. First there's Rosh Hashanah, which is the New Year, and then Yom Kippur, which is a holiday, and Sukkot. And he interrupts me and he says, oh yes, and it's followed by Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. And I looked at him and I said, 1 minute, I mean, you're right, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. How do you know that? And he said to me, Marshall said to me, that I was born and raised in Baltimore, in the Jewish neighborhood. And I was the one who went around turning off the lights on Friday night for the Jewish neighbors. So that started us off on a very good relationship. And we had an excellent relationship during this entire period that he was Solicitor General. And so much so that after he was appointed to the Supreme Court by Johnson, within 1 year or very shortly thereafter, he called me up and asked me to, when I was already in private practice, to represent a petitioner in a case that the court had taken, which you have to, sort of be specially appointed for, but that's an indication of how highly he thought of me. But anyway, as an assistant to the Solicitor General, I argued cases in the Supreme Court. And of course, you sort of were very happy when the Solicitor General, who had to hand out the assignments, asked you whether you wanted to argue this in this case. So of course, if I can argue a case. So you got to argue 2, 3, maybe 4, cases a year in the Supreme Court. And there was never a case that I turned down that I was offered except one. And that was a case called Afroyim versus Rusk. Afroyim, Afroyim. And Rusk was the government. And that was a case in which a guy was deprived of American citizenship because he had voted in an Israeli election. And I said, no, I'm not going to argue. I can't, in good conscience, argue for the government. You didn't always argue cases that you agreed with, but this was over the line. So I turned that down. And fortunately, the Supreme Court held, in an opinion by Justice Black, that it was unconstitutional to take away American citizenship because of an act like that against unless one volunteered to give up his American citizenship. So that was the only case I turned down during the years I was in the Solicitor General's office. But I argued an average, I guess, of 3 cases each term during that period that I was there, when Cox was Solicitor General and then when Marshall was Solicitor General. I also argued the Hoffa case for the government, both in the Court of Appeals and in the Supreme Court of the United States, and won it in both the Court of Appeals and in the Supreme Court. And during that entire time, of course, I stayed in touch with the Jewish community, people like Marvin Schick or other volunteers, lawyers who were working for Jewish causes would at times, call me. They would ask me sometimes for advice. There are things I couldn't deal with because I was working for the government. My good friend and classmate, Phil Hyman, Heymann, had been in the Solicitor General's office. And then when Nicholas Katzenbach, who I got to know personally, became the Undersecretary of State, went from the Department of Justice to the Department of State, Hyman went along with him to work at the State Department. And then Hyman was promoted to a different job. And Katzenbach asked me whether I would be willing to leave the Department of Justice, the Solicitor General's office, and go to the State Department to take the job that Hyman had just left. And frankly, one of the things that attracted me was that it was accompanied with a very substantial increase in salary. I went from a GS, whatever it was, to an FS1, which was the top non-presidential appointee salary. So I said yes. So I went to the State Department. That was in April of 1967. I went to the State Department as Deputy Administrator of the Office of Security and Consular Affairs. And much to my shock, and the shock of the whole world, of course, the Six-Day War broke out shortly after I went to the State Department. So I was at the State Department. You asked me whether there was any anti-Semitism. There was anti-Semitism at the State Department in the person of the head of the passport office, who was in theory my subordinate. I was her superior. Her name was Frances Knight. She was an extreme right-winger who had been kept on as the head of the passport office past her ordinary retirement age. And she was very dictatorial. She would, ran the passport office and was very hostile, I think, to Jews and to Israel. But I came in as her superior, as a deputy administrator of the Bureau of Security and Consular Affairs, The administrator was a black woman by the name of Barbara Watson, who was very nice, not particularly accomplished or brilliant, but nonetheless she occupied that position. And I was her deputy, and one of the things I was in charge of as her deputy was the passport office. So along came the Six-Day War, and at the State Department, they were galvanized into action. There would be meetings all the time about the Six-Day War, about what was going on in Israel. And I would be invited to these meetings, but it was clear that we were doing nothing that was of any real significance at the State Department. It was all being run out of the White House by Lyndon Johnson and his immediate advisors at the White House. The one area that was sort of neglected during the Six-Day War was the question of Jews in Arab countries. And when I saw some cables which talked about the plight of the Jews in Egypt and in some of the other Arab countries, I decided that's something that I have to take an interest in and maybe can affect. So I drafted some cables to support the efforts being made to provide for the Jews in the Arab countries, in Egypt particularly. In Egypt, the Spanish ambassador in Egypt was very supportive of the Jews who were being mistreated in Egypt as a result of the Six-Day War. And I drafted and had cables sent out. I probably could get copies of them now. They're probably in the public domain. But I drafted and sent out cables telling the American embassy people to support what he was doing. And he arranged to have Jews in Cairo and elsewhere brought out to the port in Alexandria from which they could leave and make their way to France and Italy by boat. And that saved, frankly, a lot of Jews in Egypt. And I was involved in those efforts in 1967. So I spent my time at the State Department, but because Frances Knight hated me. She hated me because what happened was after the Six-Day War ended, during the war, just immediately when it broke out, the president, Lyndon Johnson himself, directed the State Department to prohibit or to close off and to make American passports invalid for travel to any country between Iran and Morocco. That whole area was barred to American citizens. You couldn't travel there with an American passport unless you had a special validation that made it permissible. And they enforced that by seizing any American plane that would transport an American citizen to Israel, essentially, because that was covered by the prohibition. After the war ended, I thought American passports should be made valid for travel to Israel. And I went up to Nick Katzenbach and said to him, can we get an announcement that American passports are valid even without this special endorsement for travel to Israel? He said, I'll ask the president. So he had a meeting at the White House about different subjects. But he came back and he tells me, no, the president is afraid that you shouldn't, does not want to have Americans travel to that area, even after the war was over. But under the regulations, if you were a reporter or a doctor or had some special circumstance, you could ask for a special validation that would allow you to travel to any one of those countries or to Israel. So people in New York, among them names I recognized of Jews in New York, said, I want to go to Israel. So they would submit an application to the passport office for a validation that would allow them to go to Israel. Those applications were sent to Washington, and they went to Frances Knight. And she said, no, there's a regulation that says you can't. And there was a form which she signed, everyone, that said, denied, 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 denied. And the applications started multiplying. You know, in the week after the war was over, or the 10 days, they started coming in shopping carts. Hers was not the last word. I had the last word. She would say deny, and then they would all come up to me. And I went to Nick Katzenbach. I said, look, we have to lift this. And he said, the president is not agreeing. He does not want to lift it. But, said Katzenbach, if you have the authority, you can exercise it liberally. So I sat there, and literally there were hundreds of applications where she wrote denied, and I wrote grant and put my initials after it. So that there are hundreds of people, Jews from New York or elsewhere in the United States, who traveled to Israel right after the Six-Day War because I overruled Frances Knight. She said no, and I said yes. And from then on, we had a running battle. It was horrible. I spent that year in the State Department. Whenever she would write a memorandum about Mr. Lewin, she would say, Mr. Lewin, comma, who undermined American travel policy, in 1967, comma, says so and such, but I disagree. It was a running battle throughout the entire year. And after about a year in the State Department, when I was really suffering from these attacks, I got a call from Steve Pollock, who had been in the office of the Solicitor General till shortly before I came, but who was a friend. And he said to me, I've been offered by the Lyndon Johnson administration the opportunity to be the Assistant Attorney General in charge of civil rights. Will you agree to come back from the State Department to be my deputy? That saved me, really. I was hating the time at the State Department. It was a terrible experience, and I agreed. I had, by the way, I forgot to mention that during the time that I was in the Solicitor General's office, the Department of Justice was prosecuting the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. And Nick Katzenbach, who was then Attorney General, told me that he wanted me to go down to Mississippi and help John Doerr and the DOAR and his team as a legal specialty work on legal memoranda and analysis and things of that kind in connection with that criminal prosecution. So for a few weeks, I went down to Mississippi. I was down there at a time when if you identified yourself as being with the Civil Rights Division, you were probably jeopardizing your life. And it was an uncomfortable time, but I worked for the prosecution in the murder of the 3 civil rights workers. That was while I was in the Solicitor General's office. So when Steve Pollock asked me to come back, I agreed. And I went, and for a year in the Civil Rights Division, I wrote briefs and handled cases involving civil rights. I've got 3 volumes up there on the shelf that were given to me when I left that job. They're called the Lewin Era, is what the people who gave it to me call them on the spine of those briefs. But those were cases that I wrote briefs in the Supreme Court and in courts of appeals, supporting the very aggressive civil rights work that was being done by the Department of Justice in the closing years of the Lyndon Johnson administration. And then there was the election in 1969, 1968, which elected Richard Nixon. And Nixon was elected when I was Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division, and Steve Pollack was going to be replaced, and he was replaced by a man named Jerris Leonard, who was a very nice lawyer from the Midwest. Leonard asked me to stay on as his deputy, and the new Attorney General, a guy by the name of John Mitchell, asked me to stay, and I thought I would until I got a phone call from Jack Miller, who I had worked for in the Criminal Division, who had left and formed the law firm, asking me whether I would join him as a lawyer in the law firm that he was forming. And after discussions with my wife, who felt that it was about time that I earned a real living, I agreed. So that's how we came to be Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin, with Lewin as the last name of that law firm, which was for a number of years a boutique firm that the leading Washington law firms that had not yet gotten acclimated to having to defend people accused of white-collar crime, but they would come to Jack Miller, or to me for that matter, to go and represent these defendants, which we did. We had this specialty. I had, prior to that time, kept in touch with people like Rabbi Scherer of the Aguda and Marvin Schick and other Orthodox Jewish activists about the positions they were taking and the organization that Schick had, Scherer and others had formed called COLPA, National Jewish Commission on Law and Public Affairs. And although I could not actually, because I was a government employee, take any real steps on behalf of COLPA, I did talk to them about the positions that they were taking and supported the kinds of things they were advocating. After I went into private practice, I very quickly became a substantial participant in the COLPA activities, and wrote briefs that I signed as a partner of Miller, Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin, that were filed on behalf of COLPA in very many of the important cases that were then before the Supreme Court or courts of appeals. Why was I doing this? Because I grew up thinking that that's what you had to do. I mean, I saw my father doing it. I knew that my grandfather had done it. I knew that my great-grandfather had done it. No other possibility existed. It wasn't a deliberate choice, career choice. I took for granted. That's what you had to do. I mean, as an Orthodox Jew who had been fortunate enough to get educated in the law at the Harvard Law School and have all these opportunities, I said, sure. I mean, if I could, I would do things on behalf of the Orthodox Jewish community. And, back when I was at the Harvard Law School and at the Harvard Law Review, I was asked to do things that would help the Orthodox Jewish community. There was the famous, I don't know whether you know it, the famous Mount Clemens case, where it's a shul in Mount Clemens, Illinois, I think it was, that had been Orthodox, decided to remove their mechitza and become conservative. And the people who were Orthodox brought a lawsuit saying that was what they called a departure from doctrine. It wasn't permissible. And I was on the Harvard Law Review, and I was asked by Orthodox representatives, Mo Feuerstein, get the Harvard Law Review to notice this case. It's an important case. We want it. That it's a departure from doctrine to remove a mechitza. And of course I did that. I went to the Harvard Law Review, my colleagues. I said, this is a case we ought to write up. And they wrote it up. Unfortunately, they didn't necessarily agree totally in the write-up with what the court had done. But that's the way I viewed what I was doing with the law. The Harvard Law Review had a Supreme Court note on the Sunday law cases, and the question was, should Shomrei Shabbos, Sabbath observers, be exempted from Sunday law, the Sunday laws? And of course, I argue, yes, they should be. That was up in the Supreme Court, a case called Braunfeld versus Brown. My editors at the Harvard Law Review disagreed. And ultimately, they wrote an opinion which rejected the claim of the Sabbatarians. But my position at the Harvard Law Review, which my colleagues knew, was that if you were a Sabbath observer, you should have a right under the Constitution. So that's been natural to me. It hasn't been something which I felt I had to make a very deliberate choice about. I mean, to the extent I could, I did it. That's true to this day. I mean, when people ask me about legal actions that would help Israel or the Jewish community, my instinct is, to the extent I'm able to do it, still able to do it, of course I want to do it.
And what impact did this have on your family life? You sound very busy.
Oh, yes. There's no question. My wife will tell you I was totally preoccupied with work. I mean, the ultimate of it was, I think, that when our second daughter was born, I think, and my wife had to leave the hospital, it had to be a friend. I had to be out of town, and a friend had to take her and the newborn baby out of the hospital and bring them home. I mean, the time demands were such that they had an effect, but, Ricky accepted that. I mean, she accepted the fact that along with the the applause and some financial benefit from being a leading litigator came certain costs. I tried to spend as much time as I could with our daughters. We took them whenever we traveled abroad. We took them with us, both to Israel when they were young and to Europe, so that they were not separate from us. The experiences they had as, young girls growing up were, I think, very family-oriented. I was interested in their education, but there's no question, the professional commitments had their cost. But we made sure to give them, a first-rate Jewish education. And then when the time came to get in terms of a secular education, my wife felt that the education that our daughters were getting at the Hebrew Academy of Greater Washington, the secular education, was not challenging enough for them. And at her suggestion, I visited the Holton Arms School, which was a girls' school up here in suburban Maryland, and was struck by how the academic discipline, how strong that was. So we enrolled first Aliza for her education and then Nama for hers at Holton Arms, and supplemented it with both my teaching and other teachers who would continue their Hebrew education. And Holton Arms was astoundingly accommodating. I mean, in every way, both in terms of diet for their lunches, in terms of recognizing their religious restrictions. I mean, they both did remarkably well at the school and are very proud of having graduated that school. But the fact that they were accepted and their religious observances were so totally respected was, to me, an indication of what the United States was like. It's not that way today, but that's what it was like when they grew up. Respect for religious observance of Jews and respect for Israel.
Did you ever return to Poland, where you were born?
Yes, there was one time when my father told me that he had been invited to deliver a series of lectures at the University of, it wasn't Warsaw, it was, trying to think where in Poland. Large city in Poland. Maybe it was Warsaw. But anyway, he was invited to deliver a series of lectures there. And Ricky suggested maybe this is the time for the family to go and tour Poland with him to get the family recollections. And we went. Ricky, I, the two girls, my mother-in-law, who was an amazing person. Ricky's mother, who lived to 97, would travel with us. She was a delight to have on the trips. She was always a full participant, would go hiking with us, would go up the mountain, everything. And so she went with us, and the then editor of the Jewish Week, Len Kapeloff, heard about it and said he wanted to go on the trip together with us. So we all went Why am I forgetting the name of the city? It's not Warsaw, it's not Lodz.
Krakow?
Krakow. That's it, at the University of Krakow. So we all went first to Krakow, where he was teaching, and then had a whole itinerary of where we were to go from there to the rest of Poland. And he took us from Krakow. We spent a couple of days there, and it was really quite an experience. I wrote it up for the Jewish Week, and as I say, it's a series, maybe it's one big issue, I don't remember, but it was a substantial thing with photographs and everything about Poland. And we went from Krakow on a Friday, I think it was. It was amazing. We drove to Rzeszów, to Russia, and saw the house where my grandfather, building that was built for my grandfather in 1926 when he became the rabbi of Rzeszów. They built this house for him. It had 1926 on the cornerstone. It was the rabbi's house. And we saw the shul that was his, which became a folklore museum. And we saw the matzeva, the grave of my great-grandfather, around which my father had built, and Ohel had built a building that protected that gravestone. And it's become a tourist site for Jewish groups going to Poland. I mean, two of our grandchildren who went on Jewish trips to Poland went there to that location, to Rzeszów. Rzeszów became a very important city recently because after the Russian-Ukrainian war broke out, frequently reporters gathered in Poland I looked at the TV, in Rzeszów, R-Z-E-S-Z-O-W, in Rzeszów, because that was a city right there close to the border, the Ukrainian border. And so we went to Rzeszów, we went to Lvov, we toured all over Poland, we went to Lodz. And since my father had retained his mastery of the Polish language through all the years in the United States, when he spoke Polish to Poles, they assumed he lived in Poland today. When we traveled around the country, there would be places that were closed to everybody else, but when my father spoke Polish to them, they opened it up. The same year we went, Alan Dershowitz, who's been a great friend for all these years, Alan went to the Yale Law School, started the year after I started the Harvard Law School. He was a year behind me. And I thought I was a big shot at Harvard. I was on the Harvard Law Review. The Harvard Law Review had its annual banquet, which just recently had, again, I still get invitations to the Harvard Law Review banquet. It had its Harvard Law Review banquet on a Saturday night, and they arranged that I would get a tuna fish salad instead of a totally kosher, cold tuna fish, fruit, instead of the regular stuff at this dinner. So I communicated with Alan, with whom I was a friend, and said, Alan, come up for this dinner. I can give you a kosher main dish and all of kosher food, because Alan was then still kosher. I said, tuna fish, come on up for the dinner. Well, he couldn't make it, so he didn't come for that dinner. I also invited, by the way, Lou Henkin, who was a Harvard Law School graduate who had clerked for Felix Frankfurter and was the son of Rabbi Henkin, and was to me the model because he had graduated the Harvard Law School and had then clerked for Felix Frankfurter as a Sabbath, as a Shomer Shabbos. And it's only recently that I learned from some descriptions of his life that Henkin ended up having to sleep at the Supreme Court on Friday nights in order to be a Sabbath observer. Frankfurter was not as kind to him as Harlan was to me. But I invited Henkin to come to the Harvard Law Review dinner. He turned me down, which was very disappointing. Dershowitz couldn't make it, but the following year he did me one better. Dershowitz became president of the Yale Law Journal because of his terrific performance at Yale. And the following year, he had a table for a kosher table with, I think, hot entrees for kosher people. So I think I went to that Yale Law Journal banquet at his invitation, and as I say, he did me one better. The only thing I can say about Dershowitz is I agree today he's a phenomenal spokesman for Israel, for the Jewish people. I was a little sorry that he did do some criticism of the judicial revisions that were proposed by the Netanyahu regime, but I consider him phenomenal spokesman, contemporary for Jewish interests, and I'm only sorry that he did not remain totally observant as he was when I knew him back in those days, and the days that he clerked for Arthur Goldberg, when we would see each other regularly, he and his then wife, who's deceased, and Ricky, and we were great friends during all that time. The only distinction I have, although he beat me in terms of the dinner, the Yale Law Journal being better than the Harvard Law Review, is that he has acknowledged to me that the only time he thinks he lost a debate is when we debated, I and he, over the question of establishment of religion, of whether you should be able to have a menorah on public property. And he debated, and his position was no, and my position was yes, and he acknowledged that I won that debate. He thinks it's the only debate he's ever lost, he says.
So you've had a wide-ranging career. I was struck by the parallel when you were working in the passport division, that you were in a similar position as had been the Japanese consul in Kovno, in contravening somebody within the government and signing the waiver, or the permission for those who desire to travel to Israel after the Yom Kippur War.
Right, but the difference is with Sugihara, he was really going against the instruction of his superiors. I went against the inclination of my inferior, but with the implied support of my superior. So I have to say that Sugihara was maybe more courageous than I was to acknowledge that.
Do you know what became of Sugihara's career when he returned from his posting in Lithuania?
Yes, well, he was called back, and he was sent off to Russia someplace. And initially, the Japanese government refused to acknowledge any importance to what he had done, but subsequently, he was recognized both by the Japanese and certainly by Yad Vashem and the Jews as being a great hero. In the year 2010, I think it was, Japan had formally recognized him as a hero. I was invited to speak at the ceremonies that celebrated him. They coincided, by the way, with the election in the United States that Joe Lieberman ran in as vice president, because I remember I was communicating from Japan, trying to communicate to Lieberman over the litigation in the Gore versus Bush presidential election.
All right, then let's finish up with talking about why you wanted to share your story with the Shoah Foundation, and thank you for being willing to share it, and what you hope your legacy is.
Well, I've spent my life, maybe again following in the tradition of my father, my grandfather, great-grandfather, all that sort of fighting for Jewish rights, using whatever skills I had. And I think the Shoah Foundation is doing that with reporting the histories of those who survived. I never thought of myself as a survivor. I was a refugee. I, at an early age, was torn from my home where I would have grown up and where my life would have been totally different. What would have happened if not for Hitler and if not for the war, and if I had grown up in Poland and followed in my father's footsteps? Maybe I would be more learned. Maybe I would have made some strides in terms of European Jewish history. I was able, because we lived in an age of golden experience for Jews in the United States, to be able to get to the status that I did achieve and the accomplishments that people credit me with. I was able to make in this country, which I hope will be restored to its great openness to people and to the Jewish community in the future. I've been very, very disturbed and upset over the recent turn of events and the turbulence that's occurred in the United States and all around the world. The most disturbing thing to me is to see on the screen the people go out in the streets and advocate hatred of Jews. I know from my own upbringing and my own experience how totally unjustified that is, and how society could come to do the things that they're doing. And I would hope that my legacy when I'm gone is that I've fought for the right things, for the things that are eternally valuable. And for that, I thank the Shoah Foundation. I thank my family, both, my wife, my daughters, my grandchildren, who I hope will carry on that kind of tradition and that kind of battle. From everything that I see, they're doing so. And I'm proud of them. I'm proud of my granddaughter who's in the Israeli Defense Force. I'm proud of my daughters who fight for Jewish rights. both of them, and who, to me at least, typify what's best about the Jewish contribution to the world. So that's what I hope my life will stand for when I'm gone.
I want to thank you for sharing your story with the Shoah Foundation and adding your testimony to the archives. And I hope that some of our shared mission is reflected and carried forward by your interview.
Thank you.
Can you describe this picture for me?
Yes, this seems to be a photograph of my parents and me, probably at less than the age of 3 months old. It was marked in Lodz in March of 1936.
And this photo?
This photo is a couple of years later, again in Lodz, of me. By then, I was booby to them, but I was growing up in Lodz before Hitler invaded Poland.
What is this document?
This is the travel document that the Lithuanian government issued. It was called the Leidimas, the Safe Conduct Pass, which we used to travel in Europe after we got to Vilna. It was filled out. This was the document that had the visas that enabled us to go from Poland, from Vilna, not from Poland, but from Vilna, from Lithuania to Moscow, from Moscow to Vladivostok, from Vladivostok to Japan. There's photographs of me at the age of 4 with my mother and my father. The travel document is made out to my father, who was born in Vielichka in 1906, on January 14th. And it lists his wife, Pesla, and his son, Natan. It's the front page of the Leidimas.
And describe what's on this back side of the Leidimas.
Yes, the back side has, down in this corner, in the lower left-hand corner, the endorsement written by Jan Zwartendijk on the 22nd of July, 1940, which said that you don't need a visa to go to Suriname or Curaçao. By the way, when I said Sumatra in the interview, I didn't mean Sumatra. Sumatra was with Java and the Dutch East Indies. Suriname and Curaçao are in the Dutch West Indies off of Latin America. But this is the Jan Zwartendijk endorsement. And up in the upper right-hand corner is the famous Sugihara visa, which he wrote out in longhand on the 26th of July of 1940. You see, the Zwartendijk is the 22nd of July of 1940, and the one in the upper right-hand corner is the 26th of July, which is when Sugihara wrote out his visa. The other are different visas used in terms of the transit that we made. This was in 1941, and the one in the lower right-hand corner, again, for Isaac Lewin, Pesla, and Natan, is the British consulate in Kovno having issued a visa there that would have been good for us to travel to Palestine. But those were not what we used in terms of going.
And this that we're looking at now?
And this is the other page of the Sugihara visa, which is the British consulate for travel, which would have enabled us to go to Palestine. And in the lower right-hand corner, I think, is the Soviet visa that enabled us to travel from Moscow to go to Moscow, and then from Moscow to Vladivostok. I'm not sure what this is in the lower left-hand corner.
So this is literally life-saving document.
Yes, it was a document that saved our lives and the lives of probably close to 6,000 other Jews who were in a similar situation.
What am I looking at here?
This is the first page of the list of Sugihara issued transit visas that he issued in Kaunas in 1940 between the dates. First one is the 9th of July, and then ours, you can see that numbers 16, 17, and 18. These are the official list of visas given by the consulate to foreigners, and numbers 16, 17, and 18 are the visas that Sugihara wrote on the 26th of July, first for Rachel Sternheim, which was my grandmother, my mother's mother, then for Isaac Levin, Polish citizen, that was my father, and that visa is the one that included my mother and myself, and then number 18 for a Dutch citizen to my uncle, Levi Sternheim, who was the brother of my mother, my uncle, who perished in the Dutch East Indies.
So you were numbers 15, 16, and 16, 17, and 18 out of...
Well, the total list, which was gotten from the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo, showed that Sugihara had issued 2,139 visas before he left on the 26th of August. So we were number... We were number 16, 17, and 18 of that total.
What is this we're looking at now?
This is a manifest of the ship Tatutu Maru, which sailed from Yokohama, Japan to San Francisco and arrived on March 6, 1941. And listed as numbers 7 and 8 on those arriving on that ship were Isaac Lewin and Natan Lewin, my father and myself.
And you arrived to what port?
We arrived to San Francisco on March 6, 1941.
Tell me about this photo. And please point yourself out.
This was a photo taken in 1943, in August of 1943, of Camp Machanayim. I was obviously at that age, at that point, 7 years old, and I was, for the summer, I attended this Orthodox Jewish summer camp in the Catskills, and I appear in this picture in the center, right there. That's me.
So the second row is standing in the center.
In the center, just with a cap on, small cap. Can't see my chin, but that's me.
Was the camp co-ed?
Yes, the camp was a co-ed camp.
Yeah, these are very sad, very sobering, but I think we need to show them. Yeah, I think we'll skip the written. It has a name.
Yeah,
Has your grandmother's name there? Does it have Aaron's name?
It says Aaron Lewin.
Okay, all right. The sadness is that it never got to be used and they perished.
Right.
What is this document?
This is a page from a passport that my father secured during the war, supposedly issued by the Haitian government, recognizing the citizenship of my grandparents, Dauba Lewin and Aaron Lewin. And he tried to get that over to Lvov in order to rescue my grandparents. But it didn't make it there, didn't make it to them. It was used, obviously, because it shows 1947 as being stamped. And for a while, my father thought maybe they used it and could be there, but they weren't. And this was the page with my grandfather's photograph on it, of that very same passport that they wanted to use to rescue them from the Nazis.
And the names of these grandparents are?
Names, my grandfather was Aaron Lewin, and my grandmother was Doba Lewin, D-O-B-A.
Tell me what we're looking at now.
This was a photograph taken in 1966 of my great-grandfather's matzeva, his tombstone, in Rzeszów. And this was after the war, and it is a very descriptive of his accomplishments as the chief rabbi of Rzeszów in Poland.
Do you know what's become of that grave marker?
Yeah, well, there's very little pieces of it left in that structure at the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Rzeszów.
Do you think this is war damage, the hole?
There's Yitzchak Schmelkes. I don't know.
Can you read this? The Yizkor book?
Kelas Reisha, Sefer Zikaron?
Yeah. Well, because I have my mother's, from my mother's hometown, but it would take me years to, luckily in the 70s, one of the people from the town paid to have it translated into English.
Oh, boy. Well, translating this would be quite a job.
You know, they're digitizing these, and Jewish Gen has, I don't know how many hundreds.
Really?
Yeah. What is this book?
This is the front page of a reprint that was done some years ago after the war, but of a volume of Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes's responsa to questions that were asked of him during his life. It was originally printed in Lemberg and Lvov, and this is one of 6 volumes.
And how was Rav Yitzchak Shmelkes related to you?
Rav Yitzchak Shmelkes, who was also called the Beis Yitzchak because that's what his responsa volume was titled, was my great-great-grandfather. He was the father-in-law of the man after whom I'm named, Natan Levine, who was the rabbi of Reisha, of Zeshev. The Beis Yitzchak was the rabbi in Lemberg of Lvov.
Yeah, see, it was printed in New York.
Well, this was after the war. This is a reprint.
Mm-hmm.
All the 6 volumes are reprinted. I have originals of many of those volumes also in my library downstairs.
Wow. Well, you have another library.
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain for us what we're looking at in that framed photo with some document underneath it?
That's a photograph of the Beis Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkes, photograph taken late in the 19th century when he was the chief rabbi of Lvov, of Lemberg. And under it is a handwritten smicha that he wrote for a younger rabbi who he was certifying was qualified to judge Yorah Yorah and Yodin Yodin. That's his handwriting. And the younger rabbi ended up going to Israel and being an important rabbi in the early days of Israel, and was the one who issued a rabbinic opinion that on Israeli Independence Day you can say Hallel, the tribute that's reserved for special holidays on the Jewish calendar.
So when you say that's smicha, are you saying that is certificate of ordination?
Yes, that was a certificate of ordination. I purchased that handwritten document when the rabbi, whose name I now forget, had passed away, and his documents were put up for auction in Israel. And I saw that was the document that was in my great-great-grandfather's handwriting, and it was his handwritten ordination. So I purchased it, and I framed it together with the photograph of the Beis Yitzchak.
Thank you. Describe this photo for us.
Well, this is a photo that I've had that I think is from a preschool in Vilna when I was in Vilna at the age of 4. And why the kids are all wearing the things on their head, I don't know. But I am, the 4th, you say?
4th from the left in the seated row.
Can I turn it around?
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, the 4th from the left in the first row.
Who are the people in this photo?
These are photographs taken at the wedding of Ricky and myself in New York on August 26, 1962, with Justice Harlan and Mrs. Harlan at that wedding. It was one of the weddings in which there was a longer line to congratulate or shake hands, really, a guest, than with the bride and groom. Everybody was eager to meet with Justice Harlan, and he was such a marvelous man. He came to our wedding, enjoyed it, the Orthodox Jewish ceremony, and he and Mrs. Harlan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewin, for sharing your story and sharing these very impactful documents and photos.
Well, thank you very much for being a very good interlocutor on these matters.
Thank you.